There are places in the Spanish Royal Archive at Simancas where the files go quiet, not because the records run out, but because something was removed. Simancas is one of the oldest and most carefully maintained royal archives in the world. King Philip II established it in 1540 specifically to protect the documentary memory of the Spanish crown. Wars came and went, dynasties rose and fell. The archive survived all of it. Documents filed there in the 16th century are, in the vast majority of cases, still exactly where they were placed, which makes the gap in one particular bundle of coastal administrative correspondence from the autumn of 1587 all the more difficult to explain. The bundle itself survives. The routine documents around it survive: tax records, shipping logs, regional reports. But in the middle of that bundle, where cross-reference notations point to at least 4 administrative documents that should exist, there is nothing. The thread bindings show evidence of removal. The reference notations point to files that are no longer there. Someone took them, but before we ask who, and before we ask why, we need to ask what those documents were responding to. Because what survives in that same bundle, overlooked for centuries beneath layers of routine paperwork, is a single report from a royal scribe, written in careful, unhurried Castilian Spanish, dated autumn of 1587. It describes 3 settlements, small communities, coastal, working people, fishermen, farmers, families who had built their lives on the edge of the northern European Sea. The kinds of communities that existed in their hundreds along that coastline. The kinds of communities that history almost never remembers by name. The scribe recorded that all 3 had been destroyed, not by war, not by storm, not by any force the investigators who visited the sites could name. In a single night, 3 communities of ordinary people ceased to exist. The fires burned for days afterward. When the investigators arrived, they found cracked stone foundations, metal fittings that had partially melted and resolidified into irregular shapes, and soil that had been darkened and compacted in ways none of them could account for. They found no bodies, not a single recoverable remain from any of the 3 settlements. The scribe who wrote this report did not speculate. He recorded what the investigators had found and what the survivors on the outskirts of the affected areas had described seeing that night. And then at the bottom of his report, in slightly smaller letters, almost as a private admission, he wrote that the investigators did not know what had come from the sky. They only knew what it left behind. Now here is what makes that line so extraordinary. 1587 was not a forgotten year. It was one of the most documented years of the entire 16th century. Spain was preparing the Armada, the largest naval undertaking in its history. Every court in Europe had spies and diplomats moving constantly. Information traveled fast. Chronicles were being written in England, France, the Dutch Republic, in Jesuit houses across the continent. And yet, not one major chronicle from outside Spain recorded the destruction of 3 coastal settlements in a single night. No war claimed it, no rival power celebrated it, no religious authority in any country condemned it or called it divine punishment, no court demanded an explanation. 3 communities of real people, people with names, with children, with neighbors, with plans for the following week, vanished from the living world. And the world, as far as the surviving record shows, did not notice. That silence is not nothing. In historical investigation, an absence this complete and this consistent across multiple independent documentary traditions is itself a kind of evidence. It tells us that whatever happened that night was either too remote, too small, or too deliberately obscured to reach the major chroniclers of the age. And the gap in the Simancas archive, those missing administrative documents, removed cleanly from one of the most secure royal repositories in Europe, suggests that at least one powerful institution knew exactly what had happened, and chose to make sure it stayed quiet. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, take a moment and leave a comment. Tell us where you are and what time it is there. We read every single one. Because what those 3 communities experienced on that autumn night in 1587, what the surviving witnesses described seeing from the hills and the water, and what researchers examining the physical and documentary evidence have quietly been piecing together for decades. That is the story we are going to follow. It begins with ordinary people who had no warning and no protection. And it ends with a question that the most powerful institutions of the 16th century apparently decided the world was not ready to hear. The northern European coast in 1587 was not a gentle place to build a life. The communities that lined that coastline, from the rugged promontories of northern Spain through the low shores of Brittany and up into the coastal lowlands of the North Sea, were working settlements. Small, exposed, and entirely dependent on what the land and the sea could provide. Stone houses built low against the wind, fishing boats pulled above the tide line each evening. Fields carved out of thin coastal soil by people who understood that survival required constant, unglamorous work. These were not the communities that appeared in royal chronicles or diplomatic correspondence. They had no ambassadors, no military commanders, no claim on the attention of the powerful men who were busy, in 1587, reshaping the political and religious map of Europe. They were simply there. Generation after generation, building and rebuilding on the same exposed ground because the sea provided a living and the land provided a home, and that was enough. Try to picture the last ordinary evening in one of those settlements. Someone banking a fire against the autumn chill, a fisherman checking his nets one last time before sleep. Children put to bed in stone houses that had stood for generations and that their parents had every reason to believe would stand for generations more. The kind of evening that leaves no record because nothing worth recording happened, until it did. Those people had names, they had histories, they had everything that makes a human life real and particular and irreplaceable. History did not preserve any of it. What history preserved instead was the sky above them, and what the sky did that night. To understand what may have happened, you need to understand something about the world those settlements existed beneath, not politically, not economically, but physically. Because the atmosphere above northern Europe in the late 16th century was not behaving normally. Modern researchers studying historical solar activity have identified the 1580s as falling within a period of elevated geomagnetic disturbance. The evidence for this comes not from documents, but from the physical record preserved in ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica, and in the growth rings of trees that were alive during that period. Both of these natural archives record in their chemistry the signature of unusual solar energy reaching the Earth's surface. The sun periodically becomes more active, producing larger and more frequent solar flares, ejecting more charged particles into space, intensifying the electromagnetic environment of the Earth's upper atmosphere. These periods of elevated solar activity are not uniformly dangerous. Most pass without visible consequence at ground level, but they do alter the electromagnetic baseline of the atmosphere in ways that, under specific conditions, can produce phenomena that would have been completely inexplicable to anyone living in the 16th century. What those phenomena might look like and what they might do to the ground below them is a question we will return to. But first, consider what the sky was already doing across northern Europe in the months before that autumn night. Scattered across the documentary record of 1587, in church registers, in the private correspondence of merchants and travelers, in the observational journals of scholars, there are a handful of accounts describing unusual things seen in the night sky along the western and northern coastlines of Europe. Lights that moved without wind, colors in the sky that had no natural explanation the observers could identify, effects on animals that witnesses found deeply unsettling. These accounts are fragmentary. They come from different countries, written in different languages, by people with very different levels of education and very different frameworks for understanding what they were seeing. Any single one of them could be dismissed as misidentification, exaggeration, or simple fear, but one account from this period is harder to set aside than the others. Christoph Clavius was not a frightened villager struggling to describe something he didn't understand. He was one of the most respected scientific minds in 16th century Europe, the principal architect of the Gregorian calendar, reform that the Catholic world still uses today, a Jesuit astronomer whose observational precision was trusted by popes and monarchs. In his journals from 1587, Clavius recorded receiving reports from multiple Jesuit correspondents stationed across northern Europe, educated men, trained observers, people whose accounts he had reason to trust, describing unusual atmospheric luminosity events occurring at night along coastal areas. He noted that some reports included descriptions of effects on animals and, in at least 2 cases, damage to structures on the ground. And then Clavius, a man who had spent his entire career drawing conclusions from evidence, wrote something that stops you when you read it. He recorded the reports, he noted they were consistent with each other, and he wrote that they were inconsistent with any natural phenomenon he could identify. Then he stopped. No interpretation, no follow-up investigation. No theological framing, just the observation, and the silence that followed it. From a man of his caliber, that silence is not nothing. It suggests that Clavius understood the implications of what he was reading well enough to know that he did not want to put an interpretation on paper. In an era when every unusual natural event was expected to receive either scientific or theological explanation, a deliberate choice not to explain is itself a form of communication. What he was choosing not to say, and why, connects directly to the political world that surrounded those 3 coastal settlements in the autumn of 1587. Because 1587 was the year that Philip II of Spain was staking everything on an act of divine confidence. The Armada was not simply a military operation. Philip had framed it explicitly as a holy enterprise, a campaign blessed by God to restore Catholic order to Protestant England. He had sought and received papal support. He had told his soldiers and his sailors that they were doing God's work. The theological dimension of the Armada was not incidental to Philip's strategy, it was central to it. Now consider what the destruction of 3 Catholic coastal settlements by fire from the sky would have meant in that context. If God had just obliterated 3 communities of ordinary Catholic people with something that descended from the heavens without warning, what did that say about divine favor for Spain's holy war? What would it say to the soldiers preparing to sail? What would it say to Philip's allies, whose support he needed? What would English Protestant propagandists do with a story about Spanish settlements annihilated by heavenly fire in the same year Spain claimed to be carrying out God's will? The theological and political pressure to suppress that information would have been immediate and enormous. This does not prove that suppression is what happened. Missing documents have many explanations, and powerful institutions make self-protective decisions for many reasons. But it establishes something important about the world those 3 settlements disappeared into. They disappeared at a moment when the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe had every conceivable reason to ensure that a catastrophic and inexplicable act of destruction along his coastline never became part of the public record. And the gap in the Simancas archive, those 4 missing administrative documents, removed from one of the most secure royal repositories in Europe, leaving behind only the cross-reference notations that prove they once existed, sits inside that political moment like a question that has never received an answer. What those documents said, who ordered them removed, and whether the same pressure that shaped Philip's response also shaped the response of another powerful institution that received similar reports that same autumn. That second institution was the Catholic Church, and what survives in its archives, quietly, in a collection that researchers only began systematically examining in recent decades, adds a layer to this story that changes the nature of the question entirely. There was a woman who lived approximately 3 kilometers from the nearest of the 3 settlements. She was a farmer, elderly by the accounts that survive. She had lived on that coastal land long enough to know its rhythms, the way the sea behaved in different seasons, the way animals responded to coming storms, the way the sky looked on nights that carried weather and nights that didn't. On the afternoon before the destruction, she went to check her livestock. Every animal on her property was standing completely still, facing the same direction, not toward the settlement, toward the sea. She had never seen them behave that way before. She stood and watched them for a long time, uncertain what she was seeing. After nearly 2 hours, they collapsed simultaneously, not in distress, not in pain, simply as if something that had been holding them upright had been quietly switched off. They lay down and did not move until morning. She went inside. She did not know what the stillness meant. She had no way of knowing. That night the sky came down. This account was not preserved in the Simancas bundle. It survived in Jesuit correspondence, a letter written by a brother stationed at a small coastal mission, reporting to his superiors what he had found when he visited the affected area in the weeks following the destruction. He had spoken with survivors from the outlying farms. The elderly woman's account was one of several he recorded, with the careful, unhurried precision of a man trained to observe and document. He was not interpreting what she told him. He was simply writing it down, and that is precisely what makes it significant, because what the woman described, animals simultaneously orienting toward a fixed point and then experiencing a synchronized physical collapse, is consistent with something that no one in 1587 had any framework to understand. In modern atmospheric research, large-scale electromagnetic disturbances can affect the sensory systems of animals sensitive to magnetic orientation. Herd animals, in particular, have been documented exhibiting unusual synchronized behaviors in the hours before significant geomagnetic events, behaviors that resolve, often abruptly, when the electromagnetic disturbance peaks or passes. The Jesuit brother who recorded the woman's account had no knowledge of electromagnetic fields. He included the detail because it was part of what she told him, not because he understood its potential significance. That kind of unintentional precision, a detail recorded without comprehension that only becomes meaningful centuries later, is one of the more reliable markers of genuine historical testimony. People fabricating accounts in any era include details they understand. They do not include details whose significance won't exist for another 300 years. Now consider what else the Jesuit brother found when he visited the site of the nearest destroyed settlement. He described what he saw in careful Latin: cracked foundation stones. Metal objects, hinges, fixtures, tools that had partially melted and resolidified into shapes that made no sense if the heat had come from an ordinary fire. Soil that was darkened and compacted across the entire area of the settlement, not in the irregular patterns of a fire that spreads from a source, but uniformly, as if the heat had arrived from above rather than spreading from below. And no remains. He wrote this detail slowly, as if he was still processing it himself. He had expected to find something. Everyone who visited those sites expected to find something. The absence of any recoverable human remains from 3 destroyed settlements was not a detail that made sense under any explanation the investigators had available to them. It still doesn't make complete sense. But here is what modern atmospheric science has to say about temperatures associated with large-scale electrical discharge events, the kind of event that some researchers have proposed as a possible mechanism for what the Simancas documents describe. Plasma discharge events, when they occur at sufficient energy levels, can reach temperatures that don't merely burn organic material. They eliminate the distinction between burning and vaporizing. At those temperatures, the question of what remains is not a question of how much heat was applied. It is a question of whether anything survives the speed and completeness of the energy release. This is a theory. It is not an established fact applied to 1587, but it is a theory grounded in real atmospheric physics, and it is one of the few explanations that accounts for the specific combination of evidence the investigators found: extreme structural damage, melted metal, compacted soil, and the complete absence of organic remains. The Jesuit brother did not know any of this. He simply wrote what he saw and what the survivors told him. And then, near the end of his letter, he described what the survivors said they had seen from the hills and the water on the night it happened. A pale light, greenish-white, not rising from the ground, descending from a point high in the sky, slowly enough that at least one witness had time to stand, turn, and watch it before it reached the settlements below. Silent until the moment of contact, and then a sound that one witness compared to every bell in every church ringing at once, felt in the chest more than heard by the ears. And then the settlements were gone, not burning the way wood burns, not catching flame the way a house catches flame in a spreading fire. The structures, the witnesses said, became flame, instantly and completely. Now, here is what the scientific record has to say about the color of that light. Pale greenish-white luminosity is consistent with ionized nitrogen plasma, the specific light signature that nitrogen, which makes up the majority of the Earth's atmosphere, produces when it is electrically excited. It is the same family of light visible in the aurora borealis, which is itself a product of charged solar particles interacting with the upper atmosphere. In 1587, no one had a word for plasma. No one had a framework for ionized atmospheric gases or electromagnetic discharge events. The witnesses described what they saw using the only language they had. And what they described, filtered through that language, matches the physical signature of something that modern atmospheric physics recognizes as real, even if its occurrence at this scale has no modern equivalent. Whether that match is meaningful evidence, or a coincidence produced by reading modern science backward into ambiguous historical testimony, is a question that researchers have genuinely disagreed about. But the disagreement itself is illuminating, because the people who have examined this evidence most carefully, geologists, atmospheric physicists, historians of early modern Europe, have not dismissed it. They have argued about it. They have challenged each other's methodologies, contested each other's interpretations, pointed to gaps and inconsistencies and alternative explanations. That kind of serious academic disagreement is not what happens when evidence is easily explained away. It is what happens when evidence is real, genuinely unusual, and resistant to simple answers. And there is one more layer to this that the Jesuit brother's letter opens up. He reported that before sending his account to his provincial superior, he had already received word, from a source he described only as a senior authority, without naming him, that his investigation should cease, that his findings should be sealed and sent to Rome, that the matter should not be discussed outside the Society of Jesus. A junior brother at a small coastal mission does not receive direct instructions from senior Roman authorities about ceasing an investigation unless someone in Rome considers what he has found significant enough to require centralized control. That instruction and the Jesuit institutional culture that produced it connects directly to what was happening simultaneously inside the Spanish royal administration. Because in the same autumn the administrative follow-up documents in the Simancas archive were removed, 2 institutions, 2 separate decisions, the same autumn, the same event, and in both cases the same outcome. The silence did not happen by accident. Institutional silence, the deliberate movement of information out of public circulation, requires decision makers. It requires people who understood what they were looking at, assessed its implications, and chose a course of action. In the 16th century, those decisions were made by specific men, operating within specific political and theological pressures that we can, with care, partially reconstruct. Start with Philip II. He was not a distant, abstract monarch. He was one of the most hands-on rulers in European history, a man who read documents personally, annotated them in his own handwriting, and believed with genuine conviction that controlling information was as important as controlling territory. His archives at Simancas were not simply a storage facility, they were an instrument of governance. Philip understood that what was recorded became real in a way that what was merely spoken did not. In the autumn of 1587, Philip's attention was consumed almost entirely by the Armada. The planned invasion of England was the largest military undertaking Spain had attempted in generations. It had taken years to prepare. It had consumed enormous resources, and Philip had staked not just Spain's military prestige on its success, but his own theological convictions, his genuine belief that he was carrying out God's will against Protestant heresy. The soldiers and sailors preparing to sail understood this framing. Their commanders understood it. The Pope, whose political support Philip needed, understood it. The entire enterprise rested on a foundation of divine confidence. Now place the destruction of 3 Catholic coastal settlements into that moment. 3 communities of ordinary Catholic people, obliterated in a single night by something that descended from the sky without warning, without explanation, and without mercy. In an era when natural disasters were not understood as purely physical events, when they were read as divine messages, as signs of God's favor or displeasure, as omens that shaped the confidence of armies and the decisions of kings, the theological implications were immediate and catastrophic. If this story reached the soldiers preparing to sail with the Armada, what would it do to their confidence? If it reached the Pope, what questions would it raise about Spain's claim to divine favor? If it reached Protestant England, and English propagandists were extraordinarily skilled at using Spanish misfortunes against Spanish interests, what would they make of Catholic settlements destroyed by fire from heaven in the same year Spain claimed to be God's instrument? Philip did not need to manufacture a reason to suppress this information. The reasons were self-evident to anyone who understood the political and theological landscape of 1587. What he needed was the administrative machinery to do it quietly and completely. That machinery existed. The Simancas Archive was a Crown institution staffed by trained scribes who understood the distinction between documents that were filed for preservation and documents that were filed for removal. The cross-reference notations that survived in the 1587 bundle, pointing to files that are no longer there, are the residue of a system that was working exactly as designed, except that the design in this case was erasure rather than preservation. At least 4 documents were removed: a regional governor's report, a field investigation summary, what appears from the surviving notation to have been a casualty assessment. In one document that the partial cross-reference identifies as originating from Madrid itself, a capital-level response to a regional event. That last detail matters. Small coastal settlements destroyed by an unexplained event would not normally generate a document from Madrid. Regional events were handled regionally. The fact that the capital responded at all, and that the capital's response was among the documents subsequently removed, suggests that someone at a very senior level of the Spanish royal administration considered this event significant enough to require direct central attention, and then considered it significant enough to make that attention disappear. Now moved from Madrid to Rome, the Society of Jesus in 1587 was the most internationally connected Catholic institution in the world. Jesuit brothers were stationed across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They corresponded constantly with their superiors, sending detailed reports about local conditions, events, and observations. That correspondence network was, among other things, an extraordinary intelligence-gathering system, one that Rome used to maintain awareness of events across the known world. When a Jesuit brother at a small coastal mission reported that 3 nearby settlements had been destroyed by what he described as heavenly fire, and when that report was consistent with similar accounts arriving from other Jesuit correspondents across Northern Europe, the Society's senior leadership was not receiving isolated local news. They were receiving a pattern, and the instruction that came back: cease the investigation, seal the findings, send everything to Rome, speak to no one outside the Society, was not the response of an institution that was confused or uncertain about what it was hearing. It was the response of an institution that understood exactly what it was hearing and had decided how to handle it. Here is what makes the parallel between the Spanish and Jesuit responses so striking. These were not coordinated institutions acting under a single authority. Philip II and the Jesuit leadership had a complicated relationship in 1587, cooperative in some respects, tense in others. They did not share a single administrative chain of command. They did not communicate daily. They were separate powers with separate interests operating in the same political and theological universe. And yet, within the same autumn, both institutions made the same decision about the same event. Remove it from circulation. Do not investigate further. Do not discuss it publicly. That parallel is not proof of coordination. It may simply reflect the fact that both institutions faced the same impossible theological problem and arrived independently at the same solution. But it raises a question that the surviving record cannot fully answer. Was this the first time either institution had encountered something like this? The speed of the response suggests familiarity, not with this specific event, but with the category of event, something atmospheric, unexplained, and theologically dangerous. The decision to suppress was not agonized over, as far as the surviving evidence shows. It was made quickly, cleanly, and with apparent confidence about the correct course of action. Institutions that are encountering something for the first time tend to deliberate. They convene meetings. They seek advice. They leave behind the documentary residue of uncertainty. What the Simancas gap in the Jesuit instruction share is the absence of that residue. No deliberation visible in the surviving record, no uncertainty, just a clean, swift, coordinated feeling movement of information out of public reach. Which suggests, and this is speculation, honestly labeled, that the frameworks for handling this kind of event may have already existed before 1587, that there may have been earlier events, earlier decisions. Earlier documents filed away in archives that have not yet been examined with this question in mind. That possibility has not been investigated systematically. The archival work required to pursue it across the full range of Spanish royal, Vatican, and Northern European ecclesiastical records from the 16th century and earlier has not been done. It may never be done. Archives are vast, funding is limited, and the questions that drive historical research are shaped by what scholars currently consider worth asking. But the shape of that unanswered question, whether 1587 was an isolated event or one point in a longer, quieter history of atmospheric phenomena that powerful institutions learned over time to manage in silence, is one of the most consequential things this investigation has uncovered. Not because it can be answered, because it cannot, and because the fact that it cannot be answered is itself a product of decisions made by real people, in real positions of power, who understood what they were doing and did it anyway. While 3 communities of ordinary people lay in the ground, or didn't, because there was nothing left to lie anywhere, waiting for a history that took 400 years to begin finding them, the ground remembered what the archives tried to forget. In the early 1990s, a geologist conducting routine coastal soil surveys in the Cantabrian region of northern Spain found something that stopped his work entirely. He had not been looking for evidence of a historical catastrophe. He was mapping soil composition and coastal erosion patterns, standard regional government work, the kind that produces technical reports read by specialists and filed without ceremony. But in one location, a coastal promontory overlooking the Bay of Biscay, his instruments returned readings that didn't match anything in the surrounding terrain. The soil had been vitrified. Vitrification is what happens when Earth is subjected to temperatures high enough to melt its silica content and fuse it into glass. It is not subtle, it is not ambiguous. It is a permanent physical transformation of the ground itself, one that preserves in the molecular structure of the soil a record of what happened there long after every other trace has disappeared. In nature, vitrification occurs in a limited number of circumstances: volcanic activity, direct lightning strikes, and as 20th century nuclear testing revealed, certain kinds of extreme high-energy events that produce not just intense heat, but particle interactions at the molecular level. What the geologist found did not match volcanic geology. There was none in that area. It did not match lightning vitrification, which produces narrow branching formations called fulgurites. What he found was a broad, relatively uniform layer of vitrified material sitting approximately 40 centimeters below the current surface, covering a roughly circular area around 200 meters in diameter. Uniform. Circular, deep enough to have been covered by 4 centuries of ordinary soil accumulation. He published his findings in a regional geological journal. The paper was careful, methodologically sound, and almost entirely ignored. But not entirely. An atmospheric researcher who had spent years collecting historical accounts of unusual pre-modern atmospheric events came across the paper and cross-referenced the site coordinates against the geographic area described in the Simancas documents and the scattered 1587 atmospheric reports he had been compiling. The vitrified site sat within a few kilometers of where one of the 3 destroyed settlements had been recorded. He contacted the geologist. Together, they began asking a question that neither could answer alone. Could this site be dated with sufficient precision to connect it to 1587? The answer they received was both encouraging and frustrating. Thermoluminescence dating, a reliable technique for establishing when soil was last subjected to extreme heat, placed the vitrification event within a 50-year window centered on the late 16th century. Consistent with 1587, also consistent with 1560 or 1605 or any year in between. This is what genuine historical scientific investigation actually looks like, not a perfect match. A consistent but imprecise result that keeps the question alive without closing it. The researchers understood this. They did not claim more than the evidence supported. They looked for additional sites. Using the geographic corridor suggested by the historical atmospheric reports, they searched for similar soil anomalies at 2 other locations, one in coastal Brittany, one on the southern coast of the North Sea. They found anomalies at both. Both showed evidence of past high-temperature events in their subsurface layers. Both dated within the same thermoluminescence limits to the late 16th century. Both fell within the same geographic corridor. 3 sites, 3 anomalies, all consistent with the historical record, none of them proven to be connected to it. When these findings were published, the academic response was measured and divided in the way that genuinely contested evidence always divides serious researchers. Geologists confirmed the anomalies were real. Historians acknowledged the Simancas documents were genuine archival materials. Atmospheric physicists found the physical evidence interesting, but insufficient for strong conclusions. Several researchers raised a legitimate objection that has never been fully resolved. Vitrified soil anomalies, while uncommon, are not unknown in European coastal regions. Medieval industrial activity, certain types of kilns, large-scale burning associated with settlement clearance, early metallurgical operations, can produce localized vitrification under some conditions. The possibility that the anomalies had mundane industrial explanations was not eliminated by the initial research. What complicated that explanation was the laboratory analysis of the vitrified material itself. The isotopic composition of certain mineral fractions in the samples was anomalous. The ratios did not match what would be expected from conventional heat events, fire, industrial burning, or lightning. The laboratory noted carefully that similar isotopic signatures had been documented in soil from nuclear test sites and high-energy meteorite impact zones, locations where the interaction was not just thermal, but involved high-energy particle bombardment of the material itself. This finding was significant. It was also immediately contested. Other researchers pointed out that the isotopic analysis was based on limited samples, that the anomalies fell within ranges potentially explained by natural geological variation, and that connecting the findings to nuclear or high-energy events without extensive independent replication was premature. That debate remains unresolved. The isotopic findings have not been definitively explained by any alternative hypothesis. They have also not been replicated at the scale required to treat them as established evidence rather than a suggestive preliminary result. This is the honest state of the physical evidence: real anomalies, unusual isotopic signatures, geographic alignment with the historical record, dating consistent with but not precisely confirming 1587. Alternative explanations that have been challenged but not eliminated. It is enough to take seriously. It is not enough to conclude from. But now consider what happens when you place the physical evidence alongside the documentary record, not as proof, but as a conversation between 2 independent bodies of evidence that were never designed to speak to each other. The Simancas documents describe cracked stone foundations, melted and resolidified metal, compacted darkened soil, and the complete absence of human remains. The vitrified soil layer found at the Cantabrian site is located in an area consistent with one of the recorded settlements. The uniformity of the vitrification, broad, circular, deep, is inconsistent with the spreading pattern of conventional fire and inconsistent with the branching pattern of lightning. The isotopic signatures suggest energy interactions beyond simple heat. The witness accounts describe pale greenish-white light descending from the sky. Pale greenish-white luminosity is consistent with ionized nitrogen plasma, the light signature nitrogen produces when electrically excited, the same family of light visible in auroral events. None of these consistencies constitute proof. Each one individually can be explained away. Together, they form a pattern of convergence across independent evidence streams, physical, documentary, testimonial, that is harder to dismiss than any single element alone. And there is one more piece of this that the physical evidence raises but cannot answer. If something descended from the sky along a corridor of northern European coastline in the autumn of 1587, something energetic enough to vitrify soil, melt metal, crack stone, and leave no organic remains, it did not choose its targets. The three settlements were not military installations. They were not symbols of power or wealth. They were simply there, small, exposed, coastal, directly beneath whatever moved through that sky. The people in them had done nothing to invite what happened. They had simply built their lives in a place that, on one specific night, happened to be in the path of something the atmosphere was capable of producing, and that no one, in any century before or since, has fully understood. That randomness is perhaps the most difficult thing about this story to sit with, not the physics, not the archives, not the institutional responses of powerful men managing dangerous information. The randomness. The fact that the families in those three settlements were not chosen, were not warned, were not given any opportunity to understand what was coming or to move out of its path. They were simply there. And then the ground where they had stood held the memory of what happened for 4 centuries, waiting for someone with the right instruments and the right questions to come along and ask. The academic debate that followed the physical findings was not a simple argument between believers and skeptics. It was something more honest and more complicated than that. Researchers who examined the converging evidence, the soil anomalies, the Simancas documents, the Jesuit correspondence, the Clavius journal entries, did not divide neatly into camps. They divided along methodological lines that reflected genuine uncertainty about how to weigh different kinds of evidence against each other. The geologists were largely in agreement about the physical findings. The anomalies were real, the dating was consistent, the isotopic signatures were unusual. Where they disagreed was about causation, and causation, they correctly pointed out, was not strictly a geological question. It required atmospheric science and historical context that soil samples alone could not provide. The historians were more divided. Some found the convergence of physical and documentary evidence genuinely compelling. The geographic alignment of the soil anomalies with the historical settlement locations. The consistency of independent witness accounts from people with no known contact with each other. The parallel institutional responses from the Spanish crown and the Jesuit leadership within the same autumn. Taken together, these scholars argued, the evidence warranted serious investigation rather than dismissal. Others were more cautious, and their caution was methodologically legitimate. One criticism that proved difficult to answer cleanly was this. The research had effectively used the historical documents to interpret the physical evidence and used the physical evidence to validate the historical documents without sufficient independent anchoring points outside that loop. Each piece of evidence was lending credibility to the others, rather than being independently verified against external sources. This is a real methodological problem. It does not mean the evidence is wrong. It means the evidence is interdependent in ways that require honest acknowledgement. The atmospheric physicists occupied the most cautious position of all. They confirmed that large-scale atmospheric electrical discharge was theoretically possible under the geomagnetic conditions reconstructed for the late 16th century. They found the physical evidence genuinely interesting, but they raised a problem that the plasma discharge hypothesis has not fully resolved. An atmospheric event energetic enough to vitrify soil across 200-meter areas at 3 separate locations along a 1,200-kilometer corridor would be extraordinary by any modern measure. Events of that energy level should leave signatures in multiple independent proxy records, not just the elevated solar activity indicators from the period, but in more specific and localized ways that other natural archives from the region might be expected to preserve. Those localized signatures have not been found. Their absence is ambiguous rather than conclusive. The proxy record from the 16th century has significant gaps. An absence of evidence in an incomplete record is not the same as evidence of absence. But it is a gap in the physical case that honest reporting requires acknowledging. The alternative hypotheses received serious consideration throughout this debate. The airburst theory, the idea that a small extraterrestrial object entered the atmosphere and disintegrated before reaching the ground, producing intense ground-level heat without an impact crater, was modeled against the site evidence. It produced some consistencies. It also produced inconsistencies, particularly regarding the uniform circular distribution of the vitrified layers, which an airburst would be expected to produce with a directional bias. The industrial vitrification theory was examined and largely set aside on isotopic grounds, though never definitively eliminated. The coincidental alignment theory, that the soil anomalies and the historical settlement sites were simply unrelated, was considered and found increasingly difficult to sustain as the geographic and temporal consistencies accumulated, but remained a logical possibility that the evidence could not absolutely rule out. This is where the scientific debate stands, not at a conclusion, at a well-documented, seriously contested, genuinely unresolved question, and perhaps that is where the academic discussion should rest for a moment. Because there is something about this story that the methodological debates, for all their rigor and legitimacy, tend to push to the margins. The human cost, not as an abstraction, not as a rhetorical device to make the history feel more significant, but as the actual center of what this investigation is about. 3 settlements, 3 communities of people who woke up on an ordinary autumn morning in 1587, went about their day, and did not survive to see the following one. We do not know their names. The historical record, which was never designed to preserve the names of people in small coastal communities, did not keep them. We do not know how many people lived in each settlement. The Simancas document does not specify, and no corroborating census record has been found that covers these locations for this period. What we know is what the investigators found when they arrived: cracked stone, melted metal, compacted soil, silence. The investigators who walked across that ground in the days after the destruction were not scientists or historians. They were administrators functioning within a bureaucratic system that required them to assess damage, document findings, and report upward. They did their jobs, they wrote down what they saw. And somewhere in that writing, in the careful, unhurried language of 16th century administrative Spanish, there is a faint trace of something that goes beyond the bureaucratic function. A reaching for language adequate to what they were looking at. An awareness, however professionally suppressed, that what they were documenting was not an ordinary regional incident requiring an ordinary administrative response. They had walked through places where people had lived, where children had played in the spaces between the stone houses, where someone had hung nets to dry, and someone else had stored grain for the winter, and someone else had banked a fire against the autumn chill on what turned out to be the last night any of them would ever need warmth. And all of it was gone, not damaged, not destroyed in the way that war or storm or flood destroys things, leaving ruins, leaving traces, leaving the outline of what was there before. Gone in a way that left the investigators struggling to find adequate language. Gone in a way that the most powerful institutions in their world subsequently decided should itself disappear from the record. The people of those 3 settlements were erased twice, once by whatever came from the sky, and once by the men who decided that what happened to them was too dangerous to acknowledge. That second erasure is, in some ways, the more troubling one, because it was a choice, made by people who understood what they were choosing, who weighed the political and theological costs of acknowledgement against the human cost of silence and chose silence. 400 years later, the silence is incomplete. The soil preserved what the archives tried to erase. The Jesuit brothers' letter survived in a collection that no one thought to purge. The cross-reference notations in the Simancas bundle pointed, for anyone who looked carefully enough, to the shape of what had been removed. History has a way of preserving its own contradictions. And sometimes, 4 centuries later, those contradictions are enough to begin reconstructing what was lost. Not completely, not with the certainty that the people who lived in those settlements deserved, but enough to say with reasonable confidence that something happened there, that it was real, that it was witnessed, that it was significant enough to frighten the most powerful institutions in 16th century Europe into silence, and that the people it happened to, nameless, unremembered, erased from the record by forces they never knew existed, were real. They were there, and they deserved better than 400 years of silence. Which brings us finally to what this investigation can honestly conclude, and what it cannot. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with something rarer. It ends with evidence, incomplete, contested, genuinely ambiguous, that points toward something real without fully defining what that something was. And it ends with people, ordinary people whose names the historical record did not preserve, and whose final hours no document describes with anything approaching completeness. That combination, partial evidence and irretrievable human loss, is not a failure of the investigation. It is the honest condition of history when you push far enough back into the past and ask questions about events that powerful institutions work to erase. So let's be precise about what this investigation has established. The Simancas archive is real. The filing gap in the 1587 Coastal Correspondence Bundle is real. The cross-reference notations pointing to removed documents are genuine archival evidence that something was taken out. Whether that removal constitutes deliberate suppression or reflects the ordinary attrition of a 500-year-old archive is a question the surviving record cannot definitively answer. But the pattern of the gap, specific documents removed, filing infrastructure intact around them, a capital-level response among the missing files, is harder to explain by ordinary archival accident than by deliberate action. Christoph Clavius was real. His observational journals survive. His decision to record consistent reports of unusual Northern European atmospheric events in 1587, without offering interpretation, is documented. For a man of his scientific stature and institutional position, that choice of silence is genuinely unexplained. The Jesuit institutional response, the instruction to a brother in the field to cease investigation, seal findings, and report to Rome, is consistent with documented Jesuit practice when brothers reported events with potential theological implications. It is also consistent with something more deliberate. The surviving evidence does not allow us to be certain which it was. The soil anomalies in the coastal regions consistent with the historical settlement locations are real physical findings. The thermoluminescence dating is consistent with the late 16th century. The isotopic signatures are genuinely unusual and not fully explained by any conventional mechanism yet proposed. The alternative explanations, industrial vitrification, coincidental alignment, airburst events, have been seriously considered and not definitively eliminated. The witness accounts, the pale descending light, the silence before impact, the instantaneous destruction, the absence of remains, the animals standing motionless facing the sea, survive in archival materials that are genuine. Their consistency across independent observers is notable. Their inconsistencies in certain details are also real and have not been fully resolved. The plasma discharge hypothesis is physically coherent. It is consistent with the available evidence in its broad outlines. It has not been proven, it has not been disproven. That is what the evidence actually shows, not a solved mystery. A well-documented unsolved one, with a leading hypothesis surrounded by legitimate uncertainty and unresolved competing explanations. And if that feels unsatisfying, if you came to this story hoping for a clean conclusion, consider what the alternative would require. It would require pretending that the evidence is more definitive than it is. It would require presenting a theory as a fact because the theory is compelling and the evidence is suggestive. It would require doing to the historical record exactly what the institutions of 1587 did to it, shaping it to produce a more satisfying and less complicated story than the truth actually supports. The people who lived in those three settlements deserve better than that. They deserve a history that takes them seriously enough to be honest about what we know and what we don't. That acknowledges the reality of what happened to them without inflating the evidence to make the story feel more complete than it is. That holds the uncertainty and the human loss together without resolving one at the expense of the other. Picture the last ordinary evening in one of those settlements one more time. Not the physics, not the archives, not the institutional responses of powerful men in distant cities, just the evening. Someone finishing the day's work as the autumn light faded over the Atlantic. Someone calling children in from outside. Someone looking at the sky, perhaps noticing something, perhaps not, before turning back toward the warmth and the light inside. They had no warning, they had no understanding of what was coming. They had no opportunity to run, to hide, to say goodbye to the people they loved. Whatever came from that sky, it gave them nothing. And the institutions that learned what had happened gave them nothing either. No acknowledgement, no record, no monument, no name preserved in any document that has survived to be read. What they have, 4 centuries later, is this. A geologist who noticed something wrong in the soil, a filing gap that pointed to what had been removed, a Jesuit brother's letter that survived in an archive no one thought to purge, a scientist's unexplained silence in a journal that outlasted his caution. Small things, incomplete things, but real enough to say that those communities existed, that what happened to them was witnessed, that the most powerful institutions in their world considered it significant enough to erase, and that the erasure, for all its thoroughness, was not complete. History preserved its own contradictions, as it always does. And the contradictions, read carefully and honestly, are enough to ensure that 3 communities of ordinary people, nameless, forgotten, erased twice over, are not entirely lost. They were there. The ground remembers. And now so do you. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Tell us what stayed with you. Tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Subscribe to Forgotten Echoes. Because the archive is larger than anyone has told you, and the stories it contains, incomplete, contested, stubbornly real, are worth every hour spent looking for them.